The courtroom fell silent as the judge's eyes locked with mine, his face going pale. Still, I didn't flinch, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. As his gaze faltered, I could feel Rachel's eyes on me from across the room, her confusion sharp, her trust shattered. While everyone else waited for him to speak, it hit me. She had no idea who I really was, who I'd become. That's when I realized this was no longer just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the truth, even if it meant losing her forever. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Jack Turner sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, unnoticed by most of the people present. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, resting on the edge of his cane. The worn leather of his jacket creaked slightly as he shifted in his seat, but the noise was drowned out by the low murmur of the trial beginning. Jack's physical presence, an older man with thinning hair and the slow, deliberate movements of someone past his prime, made him seem frail, inconspicuous even. But his eyes held a depth that betrayed the stillness of his form. There was a cold intensity in them, a sharpness that cut through the haze of the present moment. The weight of the past was written in every line of his face. The case being argued was about a protracted legal dispute, a long-standing battle over property and business interests between Catherine Pierce's family and a number of other stakeholders. The courtroom buzzed with the energy of lawyers sparring and witnesses being questioned, but Jack knew better. To everyone else, it was just another high-stakes case. To him, it was personal. Every piece of evidence, every objection, every legal maneuver was part of a much deeper, darker story that no one but him understood. He had been betrayed once, stripped of everything he held dear. And now, in this very room, the time was finally coming for the reckoning. He felt his pulse quicken as he scanned the room, watching Catherine Pierce's family with quiet calculation. There, near the front of the room, sat Catherine herself, her usual polished, unbothered demeanor unwavering. But Jack knew the truth. She had done her best to bury the past, just like Ethan had. They were all the same, deceptive, calculating, and driven by their own greed. They had taken everything from him, destroyed his reputation, his career, his family. And now, they sat here in their pristine suits, pretending they were the victims. His attention shifted briefly as the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman entered, his daughter, Rachel. Jack's stomach tightened and his jaw clenched, the familiar pang of unresolved guilt rushing through him. Rachel didn't see him at first. She made her way toward an empty seat, her eyes scanning the room, her expression unreadable. There had been years of silence between them, years of broken trust, broken promises, years Jack could never undo. Rachel had distanced herself from him long ago, after everything that had happened. She hadn't understood the reasons for his actions, and maybe she never would. But she was here now, in the same room, as if nothing had ever happened. For a brief, agonizing moment, Jack was back in the past, watching her as a child, full of hope and love for him. But that was gone now. It was his fault, he knew. He had pushed her away, just as much as she had pushed him. The man he had become over the years, the man consumed by revenge, by bitterness, had no place in her life anymore. And yet, here they were, both trapped in this courtroom, facing each other like strangers. As Rachel took her seat, Jack tried not to meet her gaze. He couldn't. The weight of her silence crushed him. But she wasn't just another spectator in this trial. She was a part of it. Her life had been irrevocably changed by the Pierce family, just as his had. She had a stake in this, whether she admitted it or not. She was caught in the web of betrayal just as much as he was, and she had no idea what was coming. The trial carried on, the words spoken around him drifting in and out of focus. Jack didn't hear the specifics of the arguments. He knew what they were talking about, of course: property, money, contracts, legal jargon. It was all meaningless to him. His mind was elsewhere, running through the years, retracing his steps back to the moment of betrayal. Ethan Pierce's face flashed in his mind, his former friend, his former partner, the man who had taken everything from him. Jack remained silent. No one knew who he really was. No one understood his role in all of this. He was a ghost in this room, a quiet observer of the game unfolding. His time would come, though. Soon, the truth would be revealed, and when it was, everything would change. The judge began his deliberations, and Jack felt the familiar stirrings of resolve. He knew what had to be done. The time to step forward, to make himself known, was drawing near. Every minute that passed felt like another heartbeat, closer to the moment when he would finally make his move. He couldn't wait any longer. The pieces were in place. The trial had only just begun, but for Jack Turner, the real battle was about to begin. As the trial continued around him, Jack's mind drifted back to a time when life had been different, when he had been someone else entirely. The courtroom's cold buzz faded into the background as the memories resurfaced, vivid and sharp. He had once been a rising star in the legal world, a name that commanded respect. The years before betrayal had been filled with accolades, invitations, and endless opportunities. Jack Turner was someone people looked up to, someone they trusted. And then, there was the Pierce family. They had been like family to him, Ethan, Catherine, even their children. They had been his closest allies, his friends. He had shared his hopes, his dreams with them, trusted them as he trusted no one else. The flashbacks were sharp and unyielding. He remembered the days spent with Ethan, working side by side on cases, building their careers together. Ethan had been more than just a colleague. He had been a brother in arms, someone Jack believed would always have his back. Their families had celebrated holidays together, laughed over dinners, and spent weekends at each other's homes. There had been a camaraderie, a bond formed over years of shared experiences. Catherine, too, she had been at the center of it all, a powerful woman who had charmed her way through rooms and conversations, always so sure of herself. Jack had admired her, in some ways even looked up to her. She had a grace about her that drew people in, and Jack had been no exception. But all of that had been a lie. All of it. The memory of the betrayal came rushing back. Ethan's face, cold and calculating, as he made his choice. It was a moment Jack could never forget. They had been working on a major merger, one that would have secured both their futures. Jack had trusted Ethan implicitly, never once considering that his partner could betray him. But that's exactly what happened. Ethan had secretly gone behind his back, cutting Jack out of the deal that had been years in the making. Not just a business deal. Jack had lost everything in that betrayal. His career, his reputation, his self-respect, everything was torn apart in a single, brutal move. Jack could still hear the voice of his former partner echoing in his mind, the words ringing with the finality of a door slamming shut. "It's over, Jack. It was never personal." Ethan had said it so casually, as if it meant nothing, as if the years they had spent building their futures together were meaningless. It was a cruel, merciless cut. But Jack hadn't reacted right away. For a long time, he had stayed silent, nursing his wounds in the dark, biding his time. The anger had simmered, festering beneath the surface, but Jack had kept it in check. He had to. He had to plan, to wait for the right moment. The moment was now. As the trial unfolded before him, Jack knew the time for silence had passed. His revenge had been years in the making, and every step he had taken since that day had led him here. He had been patient because he knew that in the end, all of it would come to this. Every lie, every betrayal, every broken trust would be exposed for the world to see. In the present, the trial continued, as if nothing had changed, as if Jack were just another elderly observer in the back of the room. But to him, the events unfolding felt like a slow burn, each word, each motion, a reminder of how far he had come. His role in all of this remained hidden, but he could feel the tension mounting, the inevitable reveal looming just out of reach. He had been silent for so long, watching, waiting, and now it was almost time to speak, to make them all understand the true depth of the betrayal that had cost him everything. Rachel, seated just a few rows away, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Jack could feel her eyes on him, the weight of her gaze heavy, full of questions he wasn't ready to answer. She had no idea who he really was anymore. She hadn't known the man who had been a lawyer, a mentor, a friend. All she knew was the man who had lived in silence, consumed by revenge. Jack caught her eyes for a split second, and in that brief moment, he saw the uncertainty in her. The daughter who had once loved him without question was now a stranger to him, someone torn between the father she had once known and the man sitting in front of her now. Was she wondering what had happened to him? Was she questioning how this all began? Jack didn't know, and he wasn't sure if she was ready to understand. But the time was coming. Soon, she would see him for who he really was, and the truth would be undeniable. The tension in the courtroom built, and Jack's mind lingered on that pivotal moment, the moment when Ethan had chosen greed over their shared history, the moment when everything had shifted. Jack could feel the weight of that betrayal in his chest, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the deal anymore. It was about everything they had taken from him, and now Jack was ready to make them all face it. The moment to reveal himself was drawing near, and the trial would never be the same. The trial was entering its second day, and the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. There was a palpable tension now, a heaviness that wasn't there before. Jack could feel it, could almost taste it in the air. Every move, every word spoken seemed to carry more weight. But Jack had been waiting for this moment for years, and now, with each passing second, his plan was beginning to unfold. He wasn't just another observer anymore. He was a player in this game. The stakes had escalated, and it was time to make his first move. Jack sat still, his face a mask of calm, but inside, his mind was working relentlessly. The case was moving in the direction he wanted it to, but the key to everything, the key to his revenge, wasn't in the arguments being made by the lawyers or even in the testimonies of the witnesses. The key was in how he could subtly shift the tide, using his knowledge of the law to his advantage. He knew how to push the right buttons, how to manipulate the system without anyone even realizing what was happening. This was his domain. Jack had spent years in the legal world, a world that had once been his, and now he was using every bit of that knowledge to steer the case in his direction. The sound of the courtroom's murmurs faded as the next witness was called, but Jack's focus was unwavering. He wasn't interested in the legal drama unfolding before him. He was watching something far more personal. His eyes drifted across the room to his daughter, Rachel. She was sitting just a few rows in front of him, her gaze occasionally flicking in his direction. Jack had known that this moment would come, that his presence in the courtroom would eventually make her question everything she thought she knew about him. It was happening now. He could see it in her eyes. She didn't know what to make of him anymore. The man she had once known, the father she had trusted, wasn't the man she saw sitting there today. Jack's gaze hardened as his thoughts lingered on Rachel. He wanted to reach out to her, to explain everything, but he couldn't, not now. The bitterness of the betrayal, the years of silence, they had forged a wall between them that could never be easily broken. And as much as he hated the distance between them, he knew she wasn't ready for the truth. Not yet. The courtroom grew quieter as Ethan Pierce was called to the stand. Jack's pulse quickened, but he didn't allow any of his emotions to show. Ethan had been the one to destroy him, the one who had stabbed him in the back, who had taken everything he had worked for. Jack could still hear the cold, callous tone of Ethan's voice, the way he'd justified his betrayal as a mere business decision, as if their shared history meant nothing. The rage that had simmered inside him for so long surged once again, but Jack kept it buried deep down. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for strategy. Ethan stepped up to the stand, his usual confidence evident in the way he carried himself. He was dressed impeccably, his face a perfect mask of control. But Jack knew better. He knew the cracks in Ethan's facade, the things that Ethan couldn't hide, no matter how hard he tried. Jack's eyes locked onto him, watching every move, every gesture, as if waiting for the moment when Ethan would slip up, when the mask would fall. Ethan's voice cut through the tension in the room as he began to speak, recounting the events of the past with a practiced ease. But Jack wasn't listening to the words. He was watching the way Ethan avoided eye contact, the subtle twitch of his jaw when certain questions were asked. Jack knew him too well. He knew how to read him, even when Ethan thought he was in control. And that's when it hit Jack. The opportunity was right there in front of him. The perfect opening. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to get a better view. He had spent years biding his time for this exact moment, and now, with Ethan on the stand, it was his chance to expose the lies, the deceit. Jack's mind raced, calculating the best way to push the case further in his favor, how to turn the tide of the trial without ever being seen as the aggressor. This was a delicate dance, and Jack had been practicing for years. It wasn't just about winning. It was about making them feel the weight of the consequences, about exposing the truth that they had tried so hard to bury. Laura, the defense attorney, had been watching Jack closely from the beginning. She had begun to sense something, the subtle shift in the room whenever Jack was present. She was no fool. Laura had already started questioning Jack's motives, her instincts telling her that there was far more to this case than what met the eye. She didn't know exactly what Jack was up to yet, but she would soon. He was playing a dangerous game, and she could see it. Jack felt her gaze on him, but he didn't respond. He simply sat back in his chair, his expression impassive. The time was not yet right for a direct confrontation, but as he watched Ethan squirm on the stand, as he saw the cracks in his former friend's carefully constructed facade, Jack allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. His plan was taking shape. The pieces were falling into place. His moment was drawing near, and when it came, everything would change. The courtroom, which had once hummed with the buzz of legal banter, suddenly fell into an eerie silence. Every eye turned to Jack Turner as he rose from his seat. The sound of his cane tapping against the polished wood echoed through the space, a stark contrast to the tense stillness hanging in the air. All eyes were on him, the quiet observer, the frail old man who had sat unnoticed for so long. But now, as he stood before them, something shifted. His presence, once so easily dismissed, was now undeniable. Judge Hale's gavel hovered midair, frozen in time, as if the man himself couldn't quite process what was happening. The courtroom had been on edge for days, the legal battle intensifying with each passing minute. But this moment felt different. The judge's expression was a mix of confusion and disbelief. He opened his mouth, as though trying to form a question, but no words came out. Rachel, seated in the front row, blinked, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. She looked at her father as if seeing him for the first time, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. How could this be true? She had spent years thinking she knew him, had thought she understood the man who had abandoned her, the man who had let so much time slip away. But this revelation shattered everything she thought she knew about him. Jack's eyes met hers for a brief moment, but there was no comfort in his gaze, no apology. This wasn't about reconciliation, not yet. He had a job to do, and the time for explanations had long passed. His voice broke the silence, calm and measured. "My name is Jack Turner," he began, his words filling the courtroom, the weight of them hanging in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. "I am not just a man caught in the middle of a legal dispute. I was once a part of the world you know so well, one of the most respected figures in the legal field. I was a colleague, a mentor, and yes, an ally to both Catherine and Ethan Pierce." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people exchanged confused glances. Jack paused, allowing the words to sink in. He wasn't finished yet. "I was taken in by their charm, their promises of mutual success, their assurances that we were in this together. But in the end, it was all a lie." Jack's voice grew colder, his anger surfacing just beneath the surface, though it remained controlled, carefully hidden. "Ethan Pierce betrayed me. He destroyed me, took everything I had, my career, my reputation, my dignity. Gone. All for money, for power." His words were like knives, cutting through the tension in the room, exposing a history that no one knew existed. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her hand instinctively moving to her chest. She had heard whispers, had seen the coldness in her father's eyes over the years. But this was something she had never imagined. The man she had known, the man she had once loved, was not the quiet, broken man who had withdrawn from her life. He was someone far more dangerous, someone capable of revenge. Ethan, sitting on the other side of the room, finally broke his silence. His face twisted with surprise, then quickly contorted into a sneer of anger. You think you can just waltz in here and make accusations like that? He spat, his voice rising in a mixture of disbelief and fury. You've been living in the shadows for years, Jack. You think anyone is going to believe your lies? But Jack wasn't fazed. He remained as calm as ever, his eyes locked on Ethan's, the very man who had torn his life apart. It's not a lie, Ethan. You know that as well as I do, Jack said, his voice steady, unwavering. You know exactly what you did. And now, everyone else will know too. Laura, the defense attorney, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been aware that something wasn't right, had sensed from the beginning that Jack was playing a game far beyond what anyone else understood. But now, as the truth came crashing down, she found herself questioning her own role in this. She had entered the trial thinking she was fighting for a legal victory, but now she saw that there was something far darker at play. Was she an accomplice to Jack's revenge? Was she supporting something far more personal than legal justice? As the chaos of the courtroom grew, Jack took a step forward, his cane clicking against the floor as he moved, with a slow, deliberate grace. He was in control now. I've spent years watching from the sidelines, he continued, his voice carrying over the noise, cutting through the frenzy. Years in silence, waiting for this moment. But now I'm here, and you will all know the truth of what happened, of what they did to me. The room had erupted into a frenzy, whispers, gasps, murmurs of disbelief. Jack's revelation had shaken everyone, pulling the rug out from under the very foundation of the trial. But Jack was unshaken. His eyes scanned the courtroom, taking in the chaos, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction as he watched everything unravel. The trial had taken a dramatic turn, and nothing would ever be the same again. Everyone in that room, every lawyer, every witness, every person watching, was now forced to confront a truth they weren't prepared for. Jack Turner was no longer just a forgotten old man in the back of the room. He was the man who had been wronged. And now, the pieces of his revenge were in place. But as the room buzzed with disbelief, Jack knew this was only the beginning. The real battle, what he had been waiting for, was just about to unfold. The courtroom was quiet, the tension palpable as Jack Turner took his time to speak, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when he would finally be able to tell the truth, to reveal the depths of Ethan Pierce's betrayal. As he stood there, his mind drifted back to the past. The flashbacks were as sharp as the memories of his own downfall. Ethan had been his closest ally, his business partner, his friend. The trust Jack had placed in him was absolute. They had spent years building their careers together, side by side. Jack had believed in their shared vision, believed that together they could accomplish anything. But that belief, that trust, had been shattered in an instant. The memory came flooding back. It was a deal, one of the biggest of their careers. Jack had poured everything into it, his reputation, his time, his energy. But Ethan, always the calculating one, had betrayed him. With a few deft moves, a few whispered promises to the right people, Ethan had cut Jack out of the deal entirely. Jack had been left with nothing, his name tarnished, his career in ruins. Ethan had taken everything Jack had worked for, and with a cool detachment, he had moved on, as though their years of partnership had meant nothing. Jack's hands trembled slightly as the memory resurfaced. It was the moment everything had changed for him. The betrayal had been ruthless, calculated, and Jack had been left to pick up the pieces. It wasn't just the business, it was the personal cost, the lies, the years of loyalty he had given to someone who had never truly been loyal to him. His voice broke the silence in the courtroom, steady and deliberate. Ethan Pierce didn't just steal my career, he destroyed my life. When you take someone's work, their passion, their trust, when you tear apart everything they've built, it's not just business. It's personal. Jack's eyes never left Ethan as he spoke. He could feel the heat of Ethan's gaze, the anger rising in his former friend, but Jack was beyond being affected by it now. You didn't just take what was mine, Ethan. You took my dignity, my pride, my future. The courtroom had fallen still, hanging on every word. Jack paused for a moment, letting the weight of his statement settle before he continued. I spent years trying to move on, trying to rebuild a life that had been stolen from me, but I couldn't. The Pierce family didn't just ruin me. They ruined everything I loved. My career, my family, my relationship with my daughter. Jack's voice faltered slightly at the last part, but he steadied himself. He wasn't here to show weakness. He was here to make them see the truth, even if it cost him everything. Rachel's face appeared before his eyes, a face that had once been filled with trust and love, but now was clouded with confusion and anger. Jack had lost her too over the years. She had distanced herself from him, unable to understand why he had changed so drastically, why he had become consumed by the need for revenge. The moment snapped back to the present. Jack saw Rachel standing in the doorway of the courtroom, her eyes narrowed, her arms crossed. She had been waiting for him. The trial was a sideshow to the real conversation that had been building between them for years. She walked toward him, her footsteps heavy with the weight of what she was about to say. "Is this really what you want, Dad?" Her voice was sharp, but there was pain underneath it. "All of this, destroying your life, ruining everything we had, just for revenge." Jack's chest tightened. He had prepared himself for this moment, but hearing her words hit him like a punch. "I didn't destroy our family, Rachel. I didn't ask for this. It's not just me you should be angry with. It's them. It's Ethan and Catherine." His words were sharp, defensive, but they lacked the conviction he once thought he would have. "They're the ones who forced me into this corner. They're the ones who took everything from me." Rachel's face twisted in disbelief. "And you think all of this, is going to fix it?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You think ruining their lives will make you whole again?" Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to tell her how much it had cost him, how empty he had felt for so long. But how could he explain the years of pain, the silent suffering, the desperate need for justice that had driven him to this point? She would never understand. Not yet. Not until she knew the full truth. Before Jack could answer, Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "Enough of this," Ethan snapped, his anger boiling over. "You think you're the only one who's been wronged here, Jack? I had my own reasons for what I did. It wasn't personal. I did what I had to do." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You did what you had to do to line your pockets, Ethan. You don't get to play the victim now." The tension in the courtroom was palpable, thick with the weight of their shared history. Jack could feel the walls closing in, the pieces of his plan finally coming together. He had waited so long for this, so long to expose the truth. And now, as he looked at Ethan and then at Rachel, he knew the moment was finally here. The final part of the puzzle was ready to fall into place. As Jack continued his testimony, the room grew increasingly unsettled. He began revealing information, details that only he would know, secrets about Ethan and Catherine that no one had ever heard. It was all carefully calculated, carefully timed. The courtroom, already on edge, began to buzz with shock and disbelief. Judge Hale shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face growing visibly uneasy. Jack could feel the shift in the room. This was no longer just a legal matter. It was personal now. And as the truth continued to unravel, Jack knew that the power balance was shifting in his favor. But even as the courtroom descended into chaos, Jack knew this was just the beginning. The full cost of betrayal had yet to be paid. The trial had reached its boiling point. Every word spoken, every accusation thrown, seemed to heighten the sense of impending chaos in the courtroom. Jack Turner had started as a silent figure, overlooked and underestimated, but now he was the center of the storm. His personal vendetta, long simmering beneath the surface, had become impossible to ignore. What was once a legal battle between two families had evolved into something darker, something far more personal. The question now wasn't about the law. It was about revenge, justice, and the moral cost of Jack's relentless pursuit. Rachel sat in the back of the courtroom, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as she watched her father. She had tried to remain neutral, to distance herself from the emotional weight of what was happening, but it was impossible now. Every day, the distance between them grew wider. She could see the toll this was taking on Jack, the fury in his eyes, the coldness in his voice. But she also saw something else. The man she had once known, the father she had once loved, was being consumed by his need for vengeance. It was eating him alive, and she wasn't sure if she could save him from himself. After the latest round of testimony, Rachel couldn't sit still any longer. She slipped quietly out of the courtroom, her heart pounding. She knew where to find Laura, the defense attorney who had been caught in the middle of Jack's whirlwind. The two of them had exchanged brief words before, but Rachel now needed to speak with Laura privately, away from the eyes of the courtroom. "Laura, please," Rachel said, her voice tight with urgency. "Is there any way to stop this? Stop him before it goes too far?" Her words were a plea, her desperation palpable. She needed to understand if there was a way to pull Jack back from the brink. Laura looked at her, her expression heavy with doubt. She had been questioning Jack's motives for days, but hearing Rachel's raw emotion made the situation even more complicated. "I don't know, Rachel," Laura replied quietly, her voice laced with concern. "He's so far gone now. I'm not sure anyone can stop him. Not unless he wants to stop himself." Rachel's eyes welled up. "But why is he doing this? He's tearing everything apart. What happened to him? The man I used to know is gone." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "What happened to my father?" Laura didn't answer immediately. She only shook her head, her gaze turning inward. She had seen the transformation in Jack too. The cold, calculating man who had come into the trial was a far cry from the person she had first met. His need for revenge had overtaken everything, even the possibility of redemption. "I think the anger is so deep now. It's consuming him," Laura said finally, her voice tinged with regret. "Sometimes revenge becomes more about the destruction than the justice, and Jack's been living for that destruction." Back in the courtroom, Jack's thoughts were turning inward. As he sat there, listening to the arguments unfold, his mind drifted back to the years of silence, to the time he had spent plotting his revenge. He could feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on him, the choices that had led him here. He had been driven by something he couldn't name, something that had started small, just a flicker of anger at the betrayal, but had grown, fed by the years of bitterness, until it had consumed him entirely. At first, it had been about justice, but now Jack wasn't sure anymore. Was it justice he wanted, or was it something more, something darker? He couldn't say. All he knew was that he couldn't stop. The damage had already been done. It was too late to turn back now. Just as Jack was lost in his thoughts, Ethan Pierce's voice broke through the tension, sharp and laced with venom. "This is madness," Ethan shouted, his anger finally boiling over. "Jack Turner is trying to rewrite history here. He's twisting the truth to fit his narrative, and you're all buying into it." His words were meant to discredit Jack, to cast doubt on everything he had said. But there was an edge of desperation in Ethan's tone. He knew the walls were closing in on him. Jack didn't flinch. He'd heard this before. Ethan had been trying to regain control of the situation ever since the first revelations had come to light. But every counterattack had failed, and this one would be no different. Jack remained calm, his face an impassive mask. He had anticipated this. He had known Ethan would try to undermine him, try to spin the story into something else, but Jack was ready. His eyes locked onto Ethan's, and he held his gaze, unshaken. The courtroom was a battlefield now. People whispered among themselves, divided between those who sympathized with Jack's pain and those who believed he had crossed a moral line. There were no clear-cut heroes or villains anymore. Only people whose lives had been shattered by betrayal and revenge, with no easy path forward. The judge shifted in his seat, his discomfort visible as the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. He had been watching everything unfold with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was something personal, something that threatened to destroy everyone involved. And the more the trial went on, the more he realized he had no control over where it was headed. "How do I proceed with this?" Judge Hale muttered to himself under his breath, though the words were loud enough for Jack to hear. His hesitation was clear. The line between right and wrong, justice and revenge, had blurred completely, and now he had to make a choice. But Jack already knew. His final move was coming, and when it came, everything would change. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from tense to explosive. Every word, every gesture now carried an almost palpable weight, as if the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next revelation to break the silence. Jack Turner had made his move, revealing secrets that had shaken the foundation of the case, and now there was no turning back. The room was on edge, divided between those who had begun to sympathize with Jack's pain and those who saw him as nothing more than a man consumed by vengeance. But Jack didn't care about the opinions of those around him anymore. His focus was on one thing, his final victory. Catherine Pierce, the woman at the heart of Jack's destruction, was called to the stand. The entire room seemed to lean in, as if the weight of the moment had settled on her shoulders alone. Catherine had been the mastermind behind much of the Pierce family's deceit, but she had always managed to stay one step ahead, hidden behind her wealth, her power, and her charm. But now, she was forced to confront the man she had wronged, forced to answer for the years of manipulation, betrayal, and cruelty that had ruined Jack's life. As she took the stand, Jack's gaze never left her. She was composed, even regal, as though she were still in control. Her voice was smooth, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a crack in her perfectly constructed facade. She wasn't used to being on the defensive. She had always been the one calling the shots, the one with all the power. But now, the truth was coming for her. She could feel it, just as Jack had. "Mr. Turner's accusations are baseless," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "There is no truth to any of this. I have done nothing but try to protect my family and our legacy." Jack's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. He had waited for this moment, for her to try and spin the narrative in her favor. He had expected her to deny everything, just as Ethan had, but this time, the truth was far more dangerous than any lie she could tell. "You may have convinced yourself of that, Catherine," Jack said, his voice steady and unyielding. "But the truth has a way of coming to light." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "You and your family have spent years covering up your criminal activities. You've manipulated, deceived, and destroyed people without a second thought. And now, it's all coming back to haunt you." The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of the court stenographer's keys clicking away. Jack's words had cut through the tension like a knife, and now all eyes were on Catherine as she sat frozen, trying to maintain her composure. She had no idea how much more Jack was prepared to expose. As the trial raged on, Rachel watched from the back of the courtroom, her heart heavy with conflict. She had been torn from the start, torn between the father she once knew and the man who now stood before her, a man she barely recognized. She had always wanted to believe in him, to believe that there was some redeeming part of the man who had raised her. But now, as she watched him systematically tear down the Pierce family, she couldn't help but question everything. How far would he go? How much destruction would he leave in his wake? She had seen the damage that his quest for revenge had already caused. The man she had once known, the man who had taught her about justice, was now the very thing he had once despised, a man consumed by hatred and vengeance. And the more she watched, the more she realized she wasn't sure if she could support him anymore. Meanwhile, Ethan, feeling the pressure mounting, rose from his seat. His voice rang out with a mix of panic and anger, trying desperately to regain control of the situation. "This is all a lie," Ethan shouted. "Jack Turner has twisted everything. He's using you all to get back at us for his own failures." But his words fell flat, the desperation in his tone only serving to amplify the mistrust that had already begun to grow in the room. The more he tried to manipulate the narrative, the more the truth seemed to slip through his fingers. Jack's revelations had already started to erode the credibility of the Pierce family, and no matter how loudly Ethan shouted, the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and the court could feel it. Laura, Jack's attorney, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. She had stood by Jack, supporting him through every step of the trial, but now, as the case reached its climax, she was beginning to question whether this had all gone too far. She had always believed in justice, true justice. But what Jack was doing, what he had become, was something else entirely. "Jack," Laura whispered, stepping away from the courtroom chaos to speak with him privately. You've made your point, but look at what it's costing you. Look at what it's costing everyone in this room. Is it worth it? Jack's face hardened as he turned to her, his jaw tight with the weight of his decision. I didn't ask for this, Laura, he said quietly. They made me who I am, all of them. Catherine, Ethan. They're the ones who pushed me to this point. I'm just finishing what they started. But as he looked at his estranged daughter across the room, something shifted in his chest. The anger that had fueled him for so long began to feel like a hollow shell. He could see the confusion in Rachel's eyes, the way she recoiled from him. For the first time, Jack wondered if the price of his revenge had been too high. The courtroom had descended into chaos, divided, and now the judge was facing an impossible decision. How could he continue this trial, knowing that the stakes had escalated beyond legal boundaries? The case had moved from the realm of justice into something far more personal, and as the tension in the room mounted, the future of the trial, and Jack himself, remained uncertain. The courtroom had become a battleground, not just for justice, but for Jack Turner's soul. Every day that passed, every revelation made, only deepened the rift that had been growing between him and his daughter, Rachel. She had always been his anchor, the one person who had grounded him in a world that often seemed to spin out of control. But now, as the trial reached its apex, that bond was fraying, pulled apart by the weight of his obsession with revenge. Jack sat in the back of the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the proceedings, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Each word, each piece of evidence he had presented had pushed him further into a corner, deeper into a role he wasn't sure he could escape from anymore. He had always thought that revealing the truth would bring him peace, that it would finally allow him to reclaim what had been stolen from him. But the more he watched the emotional toll it was taking on those around him, the more he began to question whether the price of this vengeance was worth it. Rachel's face haunted him. He had seen the hurt in her eyes, the confusion and fear, as she watched her father turn into something unrecognizable. She hadn't asked for this, had never wanted to be caught in the middle of this storm. But here she was, forced to bear witness to the destruction of a man she once loved. And it wasn't just her. Jack could feel the judgment in the room, the whispers of the onlookers, the whispers in his own mind. His quest for revenge had already cost him everything, his dignity, his peace. And now, it seemed, his relationship with Rachel was teetering on the edge of collapse. The moment he had been dreading arrived when Rachel finally approached him, her steps slow but deliberate, as though every inch of ground she covered was an emotional battleground. Her face was a mask of pain, her eyes filled with anger and confusion. "How long, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, thick with emotion. "How long have you been planning this? How long have you been letting this consume you?" Her words hit Jack harder than he expected. He had spent so many years in silence, so many years building up this revenge in the dark, and now it was all laid bare. There was no hiding from the truth anymore, not even from her. "I had to, Rachel. You don't understand. They took everything from me, and now I'm taking it back." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "You don't know what it's like to have everything stripped away, to be made small by people you trusted, people you thought you knew." Rachel shook her head, the pain in her eyes palpable. "And now you're doing the same thing to me," she spat, her voice breaking. "You've been so consumed by this that you've destroyed everything we had left. Is that really what you want?" Jack's chest tightened, the truth of her words settling like a weight in his stomach. He had been so focused on destroying the Pierces, on getting his revenge, that he had forgotten the cost of it all. He had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had lost sight of her. But before Jack could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted their confrontation. Marcus, the detective who had been following the case from the beginning, stood in the doorway, watching them both with a conflicted expression. Marcus had always kept his distance, his role clear, to investigate the case, to find the truth. But now, as the trial reached its climax, he had begun to see things differently. He had watched Jack manipulate the situation, twisting the evidence to suit his own agenda, and it had gnawed at him. Marcus had been drawn into this web just as much as everyone else in the room. I never thought it would come to this, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his internal struggle. I thought I was here for justice, but now I'm not so sure. He looked at Jack, his eyes searching, trying to understand the man standing before him. You've made your point, Jack, but at what cost? Is revenge really worth destroying everyone in your path? Jack's face hardened, but there was no denying the crack in his resolve. He had been so focused on his vendetta that he hadn't allowed himself to see the people around him, the people who had been affected by his obsession. The defense team, sensing the shift in momentum, fought back with calculated precision. They tried to discredit Jack's emotional evidence, calling into question his credibility, his mental state. They painted him as a man unhinged by grief, unable to separate his personal vendetta from the legal proceedings. But Jack knew better. He had prepared for this. The more they tried to break him, the more he hardened. Later, in a private meeting with Catherine, Jack delivered the final blow. The tension between them had always been thick, but now, with everything hanging in the balance, he finally forced her to confront the truth. You didn't just ruin my career, Catherine, Jack said, his voice low, cold. You ruined everything. You made me a ghost, made me a shadow of the man I once was, and now you'll face the consequences. Catherine's expression faltered for the first time, the facade she had so carefully constructed beginning to crumble. She had never expected Jack to be so resolute, so unyielding. But it was too late for apologies now. As Jack turned back to the courtroom, he saw Rachel's face again, her confusion still etched in her features. His heart tightened. Was this really what he wanted? He had pushed so hard, fought so fiercely for revenge, but now, the cost of it all, his daughter's love, his own peace of mind, was becoming all too clear. The courtroom was tense, divided, but Jack knew one thing. This was a battle he couldn't win without losing everything. The question now was whether he would continue this destructive path or reconsider everything before it was too late. But as the proceedings continued, he could feel the pull of his anger, the bitter taste of revenge still fresh on his tongue. The courtroom, once filled with calculated tension, now simmered with an intensity that threatened to consume everyone in the room. Jack Turner had taken the stand countless times in his life, but today, everything was different. His words, his actions, they weren't just about law anymore. They were personal. They were vengeance. The trial had become a battleground not for justice, but for the pieces of Jack's soul that he had long since lost. And it was his daughter, Rachel, who would finally confront him about the cost of it all. Rachel stood in the doorway of the courtroom, her eyes locked onto Jack with a quiet intensity. There was no trace of the daughter he had once known. She was a woman now, hardened by years of emotional distance, but still, Jack could see the flicker of the girl she used to be, the girl who had loved him, unquestioningly. Now, she was all that remained of his past, and yet, he could feel her slipping away with each passing moment. Without saying a word, Rachel walked toward him, her footsteps deliberate. The entire room seemed to hush as she made her way through the space, her gaze never leaving Jack's. When she reached him, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she stood there, staring at him, as if trying to piece together the man before her. "Dad!" Rachel's voice broke the silence, trembling but filled with desperate pleading. "Please stop this. Stop the trial. Let the past stay buried. You're tearing everything apart. And for what? For revenge? Is that really what you want?" Her words cut through Jack like a blade. His heart ached at the sound of her voice, but there was no room for softness in his chest. The years of betrayal, the pain that had never healed, pulsed through him like a drumbeat. He could feel the anger bubbling up, choking everything else. How could she ask him to stop now, after everything Ethan and Catherine had done to him? How could she ask him to let go of his need for justice, his need for the world to know the truth? "I can't, Rachel," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "I can't just let this go. Ethan and Catherine, they destroyed me. They took everything from me, and now it's time for them to face what they've done. You don't understand. You've never seen how deep it cuts." Rachel's face twisted with anguish, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't back down. "And what about us, Dad? What about me?" she demanded, her voice rising, the emotion spilling out now. What have they taken from you that matters more than your own family? You've lost me. You've lost everything that could have saved you from this madness. I don't even know you anymore. The words struck Jack harder than he expected, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the weight of her grief settle on him. But it was fleeting, because the anger, the desire for retribution, was too strong. It overshadowed everything, even the pain he saw in Rachel's eyes. "I have nothing left, Rachel," he said, the words spilling out with raw emotion. "This is all I have now. If I stop now, everything they've taken from me, all of it, it will have been for nothing." Rachel stepped back, her expression a mix of disbelief and heartbreak. "Then nothing's left of you either." As Rachel walked away, the weight of her words clung to Jack, but he couldn't allow himself to acknowledge the doubt creeping in. The trial wasn't over, and neither was the war he had started. In the back of the room, Marcus Williams watched quietly. The detective had been part of this case from the beginning, but something had shifted in him. He had thought it was about justice, about truth, about right and wrong. But now, as Jack's emotional wounds spilled into the trial, Marcus realized that this wasn't about justice at all. Jack had made it personal. His obsession with vengeance had turned everything into a twisted spectacle, and Marcus wasn't sure anymore if the truth even mattered. The longer this dragged on, the more Marcus questioned his own role in it. Had he just been a pawn in Jack's game? Catherine Pierce was growing increasingly desperate. The calm and collected woman who had ruled the courtroom with an iron fist was now unraveling before everyone's eyes, her face twisted with fury as she attempted to discredit Jack's claims. "This is nothing but manipulation," Catherine yelled, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "Jack Turner is twisting the facts to fit his own narrative. He's using you all, trying to turn this into some kind of vendetta against my family." Her words echoed in the courtroom, but Jack didn't flinch. He was beyond her tactics now. Her anger was just another sign of her desperation, and it only solidified Jack's resolve. He had the truth, and truth, no matter how hard it hit, would be the final judge. In the privacy of a side room, Laura, Jack's lawyer, approached him with a quiet urgency. She had been with him through every step of the trial, but the situation was beginning to feel more like a disaster than a legal battle. "Jack," she began softly, "this is no longer about the case. It's not about the law. It's about you, about your revenge. And I have to ask, are you even capable of reconciliation anymore? Can you let this go? Or will you burn everything to the ground?" Jack stood silently for a moment, the weight of her question hanging in the air. The storm inside him raged. But something in Laura's voice, something in her concern, began to crack the armor he had built around himself. Could he really go back to the man he was? Or was this path he was on too far gone? The courtroom grew quiet as the jury deliberated, the tension palpable, hanging heavy between the judge's bench and Jack's seat. The truth was undeniable now. And as Jack stood there, in the silence that stretched between the chaos of the trial and the final verdict, he knew one thing for sure. He was at a crossroads. Would he choose the path of redemption, or would he continue down the destructive road of revenge? The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Jack Turner stood at the front, his face drawn but resolute, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand as if they were the last solid things he could hold on to. This was it, the moment he had been building toward for years, the final chapter of a story written in pain, betrayal, and vengeance. It had all led him here. And now he was about to make his final statement. His voice, steady but heavy with emotion, broke the stillness. "I stand here today not just as a man seeking justice, but as someone who has been broken, betrayed, and left in the ruins of a life that was stolen from him." Jack's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of his years of suffering. "I've spent years hiding in the shadows of my past, and now I am finally here, forced to confront the very people who shattered everything I once was." He paused, his gaze moving slowly over the room, taking in the faces of those who had once been a part of his life. His eyes locked with Catherine's, and the intensity of his stare was like a silent accusation. "Catherine Pierce," he said, her name laced with years of bitterness. You and your family didn't just ruin me. You destroyed me. You took my career, my reputation, and my very sense of self. You lied, you betrayed, and you manipulated until there was nothing left for me but rage. His voice trembled slightly, but he didn't break his gaze. I've spent years chasing this moment, waiting for the day when you would finally face the consequences of your actions. But now, standing here, I see the cost of what I've become. Jack's words faltered, but he steadied himself, knowing there was no turning back now. And that cost has been my humanity, my soul, my family. Catherine, sitting with her back ramrod straight, her face an unreadable mask, clenched her fists in her lap. But beneath the composed exterior, there was a flicker of something. Perhaps guilt, perhaps shame, an emotion Jack had never seen in her before. He wasn't sure if she was afraid of him or herself, but it was clear she wasn't prepared for his raw honesty, and that, in itself, was a small victory. Before she could respond, Jack continued, his voice hardening with determination. Ethan Pierce, you were my friend once. I trusted you like a brother, but you betrayed me for nothing more than power and money. You took everything I had, and you walked away without a second thought. He let the words sink in. But the truth is, you're just as guilty as Catherine. She didn't act alone. You played your part, and now you will finally admit it. The courtroom held its breath as Ethan shifted in his seat. The years of lies, the manipulation that had kept him safe, seemed to crumble under the weight of Jack's words. He opened his mouth, but it was Rachel, standing near the back of the room, who cut him off with a voice so sharp, so filled with raw emotion, that it seemed to vibrate through the entire courtroom. "Dad, stop!" Rachel's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her eyes red from crying. "Just stop this, please. I can't take it anymore." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as if the room itself held its breath. She moved toward Jack, her face twisted in a mixture of pain and anger. "Do you hear yourself? You've turned this trial into your own personal war. You've destroyed everything. Everything we had, just so you could have this moment of vindication. This isn't justice, it's destruction." Jack felt his chest tighten, a wave of guilt crashing over him, but he pushed it away, trying to block it out. Rachel's pain was like a knife to his heart, but how could he let go now? How could he undo all that he had fought for? "Dad, look at me." Rachel's voice broke, the floodgates of her grief finally bursting open. "You're not the man I knew anymore. I don't even know who you are." She stepped closer, tears streaming down her face. "Is this really worth it? Look at the wreckage you've caused, not just to them, but to me. You've ruined everything, your career, your life, and ours." Jack stood frozen, the weight of her words crashing over him like an unstoppable force. He had never seen his daughter like this, so raw, so broken. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he could ever explain. He wasn't sure if she would ever understand. And then, finally, Ethan spoke. His voice was strained, but there was a resignation in it that Jack hadn't expected. "All right," Ethan muttered, his eyes downcast. "I admit it. I had a hand in all of it. I betrayed you, Jack. I took what was yours. And for what? I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this far." The confession seemed to hang in the air for a moment, a long-awaited acknowledgement that finally gave Jack the satisfaction he had been searching for. But as the words settled, something inside Jack twisted. He had been fighting for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he realized that the victory was hollow. Jack turned slowly, looking at Rachel. Her face, pale and tear-streaked, was full of sorrow, but also fear. Fear that he was beyond saving. Fear that the man who had once been her father was lost forever. The judge, observing the emotional upheaval in the room, glanced at the jury. The tension was unbearable, the room divided between the truth Jack had exposed and the emotional wreckage that followed. Jack stood there as everyone watched him. No longer a man of secrets, he was now a man facing the consequences of his own actions, his own obsession. The weight of it all settled in his chest. His quest for vengeance had cost him everything: his peace, his family, his soul. And now, as the final verdict loomed, Jack wasn't sure if the cost had ever been worth it. As the judge prepared to speak, Jack stood alone, facing the truth that the trial had forever changed him. Would he continue to fight, or had he already lost everything worth saving? The courtroom fell into a thick silence as the judge's gavel rang out, the finality of the verdict hanging heavily in the air. Catherine and Ethan Pierce sat motionless, their faces betraying no emotion as the judge read the decision. The jury had deliberated, the evidence was clear, and now both of them were found guilty of the crimes that had destroyed Jack Turner's life. For a moment, Jack allowed himself to feel something, satisfaction perhaps, or relief. But it was fleeting, swept away by the cold realization that this victory, this long-awaited moment of retribution, had not given him the peace he had imagined. As the courtroom emptied, Jack stood frozen in place. The chaos of the trial had finally ended, but something inside him felt hollow. His gaze swept over the empty chairs, the witnesses who had once stood against him now gone. He had won, but what had he really gained? The emptiness was overwhelming. There had been no celebration, no moment of triumph. The weight of his victory, once so intoxicating in his mind, now felt like a leaden burden. He had fought for this, for years. And yet, now that the dust had settled, Jack realized something he hadn't anticipated. Revenge had never been about justice. It had been about filling a hole that had only grown deeper as he continued down this path. Walking out of the courtroom, Jack barely noticed the light streaming through the windows. It was as if the world had lost its color, the vibrancy drained from everything. He had expected this day to bring him closure, to restore the pieces of himself that had been ripped away. Instead, he was left with an aching void, a gnawing emptiness that he couldn't shake. The anger, the resentment, the thirst for revenge, it had all been so consuming, so blinding. But now, with the verdict handed down, there was nothing left to fuel him. Nothing but the bitter realization that vengeance had only left him broken. Days passed in a blur. Jack's life, once defined by the battle against the Pierces, felt like a ghost of itself. It wasn't just the trial that had destroyed him. It was everything that had led him here. And now, as the days dragged on, the toll of his obsession became undeniable. He thought of Rachel, of the daughter he had tried so hard to protect, only to push her away. The words she had spoken in the courtroom, words full of pain and disappointment, still echoed in his mind. She had looked at him with such raw emotion, and in her eyes he saw the man he had become. A stranger, someone driven by a thirst for revenge, someone incapable of offering the love and trust she had once given so freely. It was Rachel who ultimately made the decision. The phone call came one evening, its ring sharp in the silence of his empty house. Jack answered, his voice tight with expectation, though he knew deep down what was coming. "Dad, I can't do this anymore," Rachel said, her voice cracking. "I can't live in the shadow of your obsession. I can't forgive you for what you've done, not after everything." Her words hit him like a physical blow, a weight that crushed him to the core. Jack didn't respond. What could he say? How could he explain what had driven him? How could he tell her that he was sorry, when he didn't even know what redemption looked like anymore? He thought about the years they had lost, the moments that could never be reclaimed. He thought about the man he had become, the man he had never wanted to be. "I've lost you, haven't I?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Rachel's voice broke through again. "Yes, Dad, you have." When the call ended, Jack sat alone in his living room, the weight of her decision settling in around him like a fog. He had won the battle in the courtroom, but in his own life, he had lost everything. He had lost his daughter, his own sense of self, and most painfully, he had lost the chance at redemption that had once seemed so possible. Days later, Marcus Williams, who had been both witness and reluctant participant in Jack's journey, found him sitting alone at a bar. The detective's expression was somber as he slid into the seat next to Jack. "You know, Jack," Marcus began, his voice low, "revenge, it doesn't heal anything. It doesn't fix what's been broken. It only adds more scars." Jack didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. Marcus's words were like a mirror to the man he had become, reflecting all the pain and emptiness he had been too stubborn to see. I thought this would fix it, Jack said quietly, staring into his glass, his voice hollow. I thought it would make everything right. But now, I don't know. Marcus leaned back, his eyes full of understanding. You have to find peace within yourself, Jack, not in what you did to them. Because that's never going to bring back what you've lost. The words lingered in Jack's mind long after Marcus had left. Could he find peace now? Was it even possible after all he had sacrificed? Returning home that night, Jack walked through the quiet, empty house. The walls, once filled with the echoes of laughter and the warmth of family, now felt cold, unwelcoming. He stood in front of the mirror for a long moment, looking at the man who had been consumed by his quest for vengeance. The man staring back at him wasn't the person he used to be. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. The trial had ended, but Jack knew his true battle was only just beginning. Could he ever forgive himself for what he had done? Would he ever find a way to reclaim the pieces of himself that were left? Or was he forever lost in the wreckage of his own making? The answer was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The cost of revenge had been far higher than Jack had ever imagined, and the true reckoning, it seemed, was just beginning. The doorbell rang at Jack's house, a sound he had barely registered over the past few weeks. But today, it was different. He knew who it was before he even stood to answer. Rachel. She hadn't come by in days, maybe weeks. Since the trial had ended, she had kept her distance, giving him space. But this time, she was here, and Jack felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. He opened the door to find Rachel standing there, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. There was no warmth in her eyes, only a quiet resolve. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he even begin? How could he explain the pain he had caused, the years of silence, the choices that had led them both to this moment? Can we talk? Rachel's voice was quiet, but there was a heaviness to it, an urgency that Jack hadn't expected. He nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The silence between them was almost unbearable as Rachel walked through the doorway, her gaze scanning the room with a distant sort of detachment. She didn't look at Jack, not yet. Instead, she took a seat in the living room, the same place where they had once shared meals, laughter, and a bond that now felt broken beyond repair. Jack sat opposite her, his hands resting on his knees, unsure of how to begin. The weight of the moment was too much, and yet he knew it had to be said. He had spent so many years running from the truth, from the wreckage he had caused, but now there was no more avoiding it. Rachel was here, and she deserved to hear it. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. I'm sorry for everything I've put you through, for everything I've done, for the anger, the obsession, for pushing you away. I was so focused on revenge, so consumed by the pain they caused me, that I never stopped to think about how it was affecting you. His voice broke slightly as the words left him, a tremor of grief he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long creeping through. Rachel looked at him then, her eyes clouded with emotion, but she didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, her gaze a mixture of hurt and disbelief. You were supposed to protect me, Dad, she said, her voice thick with grief. Instead, you dragged me into your war. You destroyed everything we had. And for what? For what? Jack swallowed, his throat tight with the realization of how far he had fallen. He had spent so much time justifying his actions, convincing himself that revenge was all he needed to feel whole again. But now, with Rachel sitting there, broken, hurt, and disillusioned, he saw it for what it was, a path that had led him to nothing but emptiness. I thought I could fix it, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought that if I got them back, if I made them pay, it would make everything right. But now, I realize I've lost everything that mattered, especially you. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She had cried enough. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, she said, her voice shaking. I don't know if I can ever forget what you've done, what this has done to us. There was so much pain in her words, so much raw hurt that Jack could hardly bear it. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let his obsession with vengeance destroy the one thing he had left, his daughter? Before Jack could say anything else, his phone buzzed, pulling his attention away from Rachel for a moment. It was Laura. He didn't know why, but he answered. "Jack," Laura's voice came through, soft yet knowing. "I just wanted to check in. You're going through something so complicated, and I see it. I see the damage, but I also see you're trying. You're trying to find your way back, and that's worth something, you know." Jack's heart clenched. "I've lost everything, Laura. My daughter, my peace, myself." He trailed off, unsure of what else to say. What could he say? He had sacrificed so much, and for what? A hollow victory that had cost him everything. Laura's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You haven't lost everything, Jack. You still have time. Time to make things right. Time to rebuild what's broken." The words echoed in Jack's mind as he hung up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. Just a little. Maybe there was a chance at redemption. Maybe he could begin to heal the damage he had caused. Rachel stood up slowly, her posture tense but her gaze softer now, her emotions still raw but not as sharp. "I can't promise things will ever be the same," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to try to move forward, to heal. But you have to heal too, Dad. You have to let go of all this anger." Jack nodded, his throat tight with the weight of her words. He wanted to say something, to promise her that he would change, but he knew words weren't enough anymore. He had to show her, not with promises, but with actions. As Rachel walked toward the door, she turned back for a moment, her eyes searching his. "I'll always love you, Dad," she said softly. "But I need you to be the father I once knew. I need you to find a way back to yourself." Jack watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the true weight of his choices. But he also felt something else, something he hadn't felt in years, a sliver of hope, a chance, however small, to rebuild. The journey was far from over, but Jack knew now that the path to redemption wouldn't be easy. He had to face the consequences of his past and find a way to forgive himself, or risk losing everything that remained. The question was, could he? The door had closed behind Rachel, but Jack stood there, staring at it, knowing that the real work, his real battle, was just beginning. The courthouse doors closed softly behind Jack as he stepped out into the bright afternoon light. The sounds of the bustling city swirled around him, but in that moment, everything felt distant, muffled. It was over. The trial had ended, and the verdict had been delivered. Catherine and Ethan Pierce were convicted, their fates sealed, but Jack felt no sense of victory, no satisfaction. The weight that had carried him for so long, his relentless pursuit of revenge, had finally lifted, but instead of feeling free, he felt something he hadn't expected, an empty calm. The adrenaline, the fury that had propelled him through those endless days of courtrooms and bitter confrontations, was gone. There was nothing left but the quiet aftermath. Jack had won, but the cost was too high. He had lost Rachel, his sense of self, and the very piece of him that had once believed in redemption. Now, as he walked down the courthouse steps, each step felt like a farewell to the man he had been, a man driven by anger, by the need for retribution. But was it too late to rebuild? Was it too late to find a way back? Jack's mind wandered back to Rachel. He hadn't spoken to her since their emotional confrontation. He knew she was still processing everything, the trial, the pain, the years of her life that had been stolen by his obsession. She had made it clear that there was no simple resolution for their fractured relationship, but Jack could feel a subtle shift in her, a quiet willingness to move forward. Slowly, painfully, she was beginning to rebuild her trust in people, in herself. Jack had done his part. He had apologized, but words had never been enough. What mattered now was the space she needed to heal, the time it would take for her to forgive him. And Jack knew it would take time, maybe years, before she could look at him without that look of quiet resentment in her eyes. But that was something he had to live with. He couldn't rush her healing, any more than he could rush his own. Jack walked along the street, feeling the weight of his past decisions settle into his bones. He had let go of his need for vengeance, but it wasn't as simple as that. Letting go had been a choice, but it didn't erase the scars, the years lost to anger and regret. He knew now that revenge hadn't healed him. It hadn't brought him peace. It had only brought destruction. The emptiness he felt now was the only truth he had left. It wasn't just about winning against Catherine and Ethan. It was about everything he had lost along the way, and the painful realization that those things could never be reclaimed. But Jack was determined not to let this be the end of him. The past was behind him, but there was still a future. And though it seemed impossible, Jack had begun to believe that he could still find redemption in some form. He couldn't undo the mistakes, but perhaps he could guide others, help them avoid the same path he had taken. He started small, mentoring younger men who, like him, had been consumed by anger and regret. Men who, in their desperation, had lost sight of the bigger picture. Jack found a sense of purpose in these conversations, simple moments where he could help them see beyond their rage, beyond their brokenness. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step toward making things right. And for Jack, that was enough for now. One day, Marcus Williams found him in a small cafe, a place they both used to frequent when Marcus had been investigating Jack's case. The detective had always kept his distance during the trial, but now, with the dust settled, there was an unspoken respect between them. Marcus nodded to Jack, the old tension between them gone. "You did what you had to do," Marcus said quietly. "But I see now, Jack, you're trying, and that's something." The words weren't much, but they meant something to Jack. He had spent so long fighting against the world, against everyone who had ever doubted him, that he had forgotten what it was like to be seen for who he was, not for the mistakes he had made. Marcus had been part of the storm, but now he was offering Jack something different: understanding. Laura, too, had returned, just as quietly as she had left. She found Jack on a bench one afternoon, sitting alone by the park. "I've moved on, Jack," she said softly, her voice full of finality, but not without compassion. "I have my own life now, but I wanted to tell you, I'm proud of you. I never thought I'd say that, but you've changed, and that counts for something." Jack looked at her, feeling an unfamiliar warmth. He hadn't expected her to return, and yet here she was, offering a small measure of closure. She had been his ally throughout the trial, but now, as she walked away, Jack knew it was time for him to truly stand on his own. He had done everything he could, and the rest was up to him. That evening, Jack found himself at the ocean. The same ocean he had watched countless times, but today it felt different. The waves lapped against the shore in a quiet rhythm, steady and unyielding, just like the work ahead of him. He stood there, watching the sunset, feeling the weight of his journey settle over him. Revenge had been served, but it hadn't given him the peace he thought it would. Now, as he stared out into the horizon, he realized that the real work had only just begun. The question wasn't whether he could forgive them, it was whether he could forgive himself. For the first time in years, Jack didn't have an answer. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew he couldn't stop trying. The past had shaped him, but it didn't have to define him. There was still a future to build, still a way forward, and for Jack Turner, that was enough. The weight of the courtroom verdict settled on Jack Turner like a heavy, unyielding fog. The gavel had come down, and Catherine and Ethan Pierce had been found guilty. Justice, in its legal form, had been served. Yet, as Jack walked away from the courthouse, the adrenaline of victory quickly dissipated, leaving an emptiness that had nothing to do with the courtroom. It wasn't peace he felt. It wasn't relief. It was something far more complex, an unsettling quiet that gnawed at him with every step. The truth, the one he had so desperately fought for, had come to light. But now, he wondered, was this the outcome he had truly wanted, or had he been chasing something else entirely? Jack leaned against the cold concrete of the courthouse steps, looking out at the world that continued to move around him. He had spent so many years focused on vengeance, believing that justice would give him what he needed. But as the trial ended, he realized something. Even when the law had righted the wrongs he'd suffered, it hadn't healed the wounds inside him. He thought back to Rachel's face, her eyes filled with anger, with betrayal. The fury that had burned in her gaze in the courtroom still haunted him. How could he have let it go this far? He had won against Catherine and Ethan, but had he really won anything at all? In his quest for justice, he had lost the one person who had always meant the most to him. The memory of her pain and her words were like a persistent echo, reverberating in his mind long after the courtroom had emptied. "You destroyed everything we had," Rachel had said. "Is this what you wanted?" Jack could still hear the break in her voice, the unbearable sadness. The vengeance he had fought so hard for had only left a trail of destruction, not just for the Pierces, but for him too. What good was justice if it had cost him the chance to rebuild the only relationship that had ever mattered? The irony wasn't lost on Jack. Catherine and Ethan, the very people who had torn his life apart, were now left to rebuild theirs, picking up the pieces of their ruined lives just as he had done years ago. The difference was that they had each other, while Jack was left standing alone, surrounded by the wreckage of a life he had barely recognized. Catherine and Ethan had paid their price. But Jack realized that revenge, no matter how satisfying in the moment, had never been the true cure to his pain. The wounds that had been inflicted on him all those years ago couldn't be healed through punishment or retribution. They were wounds that could only be healed from within. Jack walked away from the courthouse, the weight of his thoughts pulling him deeper into himself. He had been so obsessed with making them pay, with getting justice, that he had failed to see the true cost of what he was doing. The most important cost wasn't measured in the courtroom. It was the part of him he had lost along the way. The bitterness, the anger, those had consumed him, and now, after the trial, they still lingered, haunting him. Could he really forgive himself for all of it? As Jack sat in his apartment, his mind wrestling with everything he had done, he found a letter from Rachel, one that she had sent weeks ago, but he had never read. With trembling hands, he opened it. Her handwriting was familiar, but the words were tentative, cautious. "I don't know if you'll ever understand, but I need you to know that I'm trying to move on. I can't forget what you've done, but I think I can forgive you. I don't know where we go from here, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to rebuild." Jack closed the letter slowly, feeling the weight of it in his chest. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a bridge, a crack in the walls that had separated them for so long. It was the first step toward healing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself a small flicker of hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution. He hadn't earned Rachel's full forgiveness, and maybe he never would. But the fact that she was reaching out, that she was willing to try, was a sign. A sign that maybe he wasn't too far gone after all. That night, Jack stood by his window looking out over the city. The skyline was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, but in his mind, the scene felt darker, clouded by the choices he had made. Yet, there was something new in his chest, a sense of possibility. He could feel the edges of his anger fading, being replaced by something he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a long time: peace. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe it wasn't too late to rebuild. Jack's quest for revenge had ended, but his journey of redemption was just beginning. He didn't know where it would take him or how long it would take to heal, but for the first time in years, Jack made a decision. He would try. He would try to rebuild, not just with Rachel, but with himself. The road ahead was uncertain, and the past would always be with him. But in that quiet moment, Jack realized that the future, whatever it held, was a chance to start again. Several months had passed since the trial, and Jack Turner had made the slow, difficult transition into a new life. Los Angeles, the sprawling city that had once been the stage for his rage and revenge, now felt like a quieter place, both familiar and foreign. The constant hum of traffic, the distant chatter of crowded streets, the gleaming skyline, all the things that used to feel suffocating now seemed distant, muted, as though Jack were looking at them through a veil. The weight of his past still lingered, but it no longer dominated him. He had spent years chasing vengeance, but now he was learning to chase something else: peace. It was a fragile thing, something he had to rebuild every day, but It was his, and that made all the difference. His relationship with Rachel was still fragile, but it was better. They met occasionally now, their conversations tentative at first, but with each meeting, a small bridge was built. They spoke less about the past, about the trial, about the anger that had driven them apart, and more about the present, about the quiet moments that allowed them to remember the father and daughter they used to be. It wasn't easy. The scars of their years apart still showed in the awkward silences, in the weight of the things they couldn't say. But there were glimpses of something else, too. There was hope, and that was enough for Jack for now. He knew he couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but the fact that Rachel was willing to try again, that she was willing to see him as more than the man who had destroyed her childhood, was a step forward. A fragile, hard-earned step, but a step nonetheless. Jack had found a new purpose in mentoring others. He had once believed that his own pain set him apart, that his suffering was a unique badge of honor in the battle for justice. But now, he understood something more important. His pain had been universal. It wasn't just his. It was a part of the human experience, loss, regret, grief. And he saw it reflected in the faces of the men who came to him for guidance. Older men, many of them scarred by decades of bitterness, of misdirected anger. They had lost loved ones, careers, families, much like he had. And through his own slow journey toward healing, Jack had learned that what he wanted more than revenge, more than justice, was connection. He wanted to help these men find their way out of the darkness, to show them that the bitterness they clung to didn't have to be the end of their story. He spent hours listening to them, talking with them, giving them the one thing they had all lost, someone who understood, someone who could help them see beyond the walls they had built around themselves. It wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't a miracle, but it was something. It was progress. And Jack felt something inside of him shift, like a long-forgotten part of his heart waking up. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly helping someone, not by punishing the guilty, but by offering a small piece of understanding. Then, one day, a letter arrived. It was from Catherine Pierce, now serving a prison sentence. Jack hadn't expected to hear from her again. The years of hatred had made him certain that her influence on his life had ended with the trial. But the letter was there, lying on the table before him. The words were formal, almost businesslike. An apology, but a hollow one. She expressed regret for the damage done, for the way things had ended between them, but it was clear that it was too little, too late. Jack read the letter slowly, feeling nothing but a brief flicker of recognition for the woman she had been. He had spent so many years of his life obsessed with making her pay, making her face the consequences of her actions. But now, reading her words, he realized something important. She no longer had any control over him. Her apology didn't matter. It wasn't what he needed. What mattered was that he had finally let go. Catherine would never be the person who could fix him or offer the redemption he had once hoped for. That was something he had to do for himself. And with that quiet realization, Jack folded the letter and put it away. He was done with her, done with the past, done with the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. Jack's days now had a new rhythm. He taught young people, young men mostly, the importance of emotional growth, of understanding themselves before they acted on their anger. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he could offer them a glimpse of a different way, a way forward, free from resentment. He shared his own mistakes with them, his own missteps, knowing that in doing so, he might help them avoid the same traps. There were days when it felt like nothing had changed, that the past was always going to be a part of him. But there were other days, quiet days, when Jack found himself genuinely smiling, when he realized that there was still so much to learn, so much life left to live. One afternoon, as he sat in a cafe, his phone buzzed. It was Laura. She hadn't called in months, not since the trial had ended. She thanked him for his courage, for standing up for what he believed in, for showing the world that he wasn't just a man driven by vengeance. But there was an unspoken understanding in the air as well. Things had changed. Their paths had diverged, and there was no going back. Laura had opened her own law firm, and Jack felt a quiet pride for her, for what she had achieved. But the distance between them was palpable. It was time for both of them to move forward. As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, Jack found himself at the beach. The ocean stretched out before him, vast and unyielding, just like his journey. The man he once was, consumed by revenge, was fading into the past. And as the waves lapped against the shore, Jack stood there, feeling the weight of the years fall away. He had lost so much, but in this moment, with the salt air in his lungs and the fading sun on the horizon, Jack Turner felt something he hadn't known in a long time. Hope. The future was unwritten. He didn't know where it would take him, but for the first time in years, he knew it was worth pursuing. And with that thought, Jack turned away from the ocean, ready to begin again. Jack's mornings had become a quiet rhythm of purpose. He still lived in Los Angeles, but the city no longer felt like a battlefield. Instead, he found peace in the small moments, whether it was the crisp morning air or the quiet of an empty street. But there was something more. Jack had started volunteering at a local community center, working with at-risk youth, many of them dealing with the same pain and anger that had once consumed him. It wasn't much, just a few hours each week, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, Jack found himself listening, really listening, to the kids who shared their stories. He saw his younger self in their eyes, confused, angry, filled with the weight of a world they didn't quite understand. He wasn't saving them. He wasn't that naive. But he could offer them something he never had when he was their age, someone who had made all the mistakes, who had been driven by anger and regret, and who had, in the end, come to understand that the only way forward was through emotional healing. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But Jack knew now that sometimes the greatest work you could do wasn't about fixing things. It was about helping others see that they had the power to heal themselves. In the midst of this, Rachel reached out. Her message was simple, almost cautious. "Dad, I'm having a family gathering next weekend. I'd like you to come." The words hung in the air, suspended between hope and uncertainty. Rachel hadn't made any promises, and neither had Jack. He knew that forgiveness wasn't a light switch you could just flip on. It was a process, a slow, sometimes painful journey. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but this invitation, tentative as it was a step forward. She wanted to try. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, Jack believed her. The days leading up to the gathering were a blur for Jack. He couldn't help but reflect on everything he had done, the years of silence, the rage that had built up until it consumed him. He thought about Rachel's face during the trial, her hurt, her disbelief. The thought of her carrying that weight, carrying his mistakes, ate at him. He had promised her the world when she was young, but somewhere along the way, his need for vengeance had become his world, and he had dragged her into it. That was the truth he hadn't wanted to face, the realization that his quest for justice had cost him the one thing that mattered most, his family. Jack had always thought of forgiveness as something you could earn, something you could demand, if you had suffered enough. But now he understood. It wasn't something you could force. It was something that had to come in its own time from both sides. And he wasn't the only one who needed to heal. Rachel had her own journey to take. When Jack arrived at the gathering, the air felt thick with the unspoken words, the tension between them. Rachel had made it clear that she wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him, but she was trying. Jack watched her, wondering if there would be a moment when things would shift, when they would both let go of the past and begin again. But the moment didn't come with grand gestures or heartfelt speeches. It came in small, quiet exchanges. They didn't talk about the trial. They didn't talk about the years of estrangement. Instead, they spoke about the present, about the small things that still connected them. Rachel laughed when Jack made a joke, a sound that was all too familiar, though it felt distant. But it was a sign, a small, fragile sign that maybe they could rebuild something. It was progress. And Jack held on to that, knowing that rebuilding trust wasn't something that could be done overnight. But the fact that they were both willing to try, that was enough. As the evening wore on, Jack sat outside on the balcony alone with his thoughts. The noise from inside the house, the chatter, the laughter, felt far away, almost like it belonged to a different life. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't known he needed. Hope. Not for forgiveness, not yet, but for the future. Maybe there was a way to move forward. Maybe there was a path that didn't lead to the same mistakes. In the days that followed, Jack took another step, one he hadn't expected. He sat down and wrote a letter to Ethan Pierce. He didn't want anything from him, didn't need any acknowledgement. Jack wasn't writing for closure, nor was he looking for an apology. He was writing to let go. He didn't need Ethan to be sorry. He needed to be free. The letter was simple, direct. I've spent too many years angry, too many years letting you control the way I see the world. But not anymore. I'm done. Jack signed it, sealed it, and put it away. There was no need to send it. It was for him, not for Ethan. Forgiveness was still a distant idea, an abstract concept that Jack was learning to accept. But what he could do, right now, was try to be a better man. Try to heal, piece by piece, and let go of the anger that had kept him chained to the past. Rachel hadn't fully forgiven him, not yet. But she was trying, and so was Jack. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, they could both find their way back to each other. As Jack sat down at his desk that evening, looking out at the city skyline, he thought about the road ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but it was his to walk, and that was all he needed to know. It was an unexpected phone call, one Jack had been half expecting, but hadn't quite anticipated. Marcus Williams, the detective who had once been part of the investigation into his life, now called Jack from a place of curiosity. It had been months since the trial, and Jack had almost forgotten about the man who had watched him so closely, who had stood in the background, observing, judging. But now Marcus was reaching out, asking to meet, wanting to discuss what had unfolded in court. Jack's fingers hesitated over the phone, the familiar tension rising in his chest. He hadn't thought about Marcus much after the trial, after everything had settled. It had all been so personal, so raw. Jack wasn't sure what Marcus wanted now, but the curiosity gnawed at him. What could Marcus possibly want to discuss? The verdict had been delivered, the judgment made, and yet here was this detective, asking to meet. Something about the invitation felt important. When they met, it was at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Marcus was already sitting at a corner table, his face unreadable as usual, though Jack noticed a subtle shift in his posture. There was no longer the sharp, clinical detachment that Jack had once felt from him. There was an openness now, something different in Marcus's eyes. Jack took a seat across from him, trying to read his old adversary, but Marcus spoke first. I've been thinking about everything that happened, Marcus began, his voice steady but tinged with something Jack hadn't heard before. Regret. Watching you go through it all, I don't think I ever really understood the depth of what you were dealing with, what drove you. You weren't just some villain chasing revenge. You were a man drowning in pain. And I didn't see that. Jack felt a sharp breath catch in his throat. This wasn't what he had expected. He had spent so much of his life believing that people saw him as a monster, a man consumed by anger. But now, Marcus was speaking of him as something different. Someone who had been shaped by hurt and loss, someone who had tried to find justice in all the wrong ways. I guess I saw you through the lens of the case, Marcus continued, the law, the facts. But what you went through, I can't imagine how it must have felt. You were so driven by that anger that it became everything. And I wonder, looking back, if that was ever really about justice or just about making someone else pay for your pain. Jack's chest tightened. He wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain how justified he had felt. But the truth of Marcus's words settled over him like a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. It wasn't just about justice. It had never been. It was about punishing those who had hurt him, about trying to reclaim something he couldn't bring back, his dignity, his control over his own life. You're not the only one who's changed, Marcus added, looking down into his cup. I've spent the last few months reflecting on the trial, on the way it all went down. You showed me something I didn't understand about justice, about the consequences of living with vengeance. It doesn't set you free, Jack. It only makes the chains tighter. Jack let the words hang in the air. He wasn't sure if Marcus was speaking out of pity or a genuine understanding, but either way, it felt like something had shifted between them. This man, once a distant observer in Jack's life, now understood the depth of his pain, and that, in itself, felt like a strange kind of redemption. As Jack left the coffee shop, the evening air felt different. The weight that had pressed on him for so long had lifted slightly, though it still lingered. People had always seen him as the villain. His name had become synonymous with revenge, with rage. But Marcus, of all people, had seen something else. And with that recognition, Jack realized that his journey wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, about who he would become now that he was no longer driven by vengeance. The next evening, as Jack sat in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. It was a simple text, but its weight was undeniable. "I've taken a big step in my healing. I wanted you to know." Jack stared at the message for a long time, the words reverberating in his chest. Rachel hadn't promised forgiveness, but she had promised something far more powerful, the willingness to heal, to move forward. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. The rift between them, the years of silence, were beginning to close, just a little. Jack could feel the shift within himself as well. He wasn't ready to leave Los Angeles yet, not completely, but the thought of a new place, a new start, a fresh beginning without the ghosts of his past chasing him, felt like a possibility. He had spent too long here, in the shadow of everything that had gone wrong. Maybe it was time to leave the city, to go somewhere that didn't carry the weight of all his failures. As Jack packed his things, he felt lighter than he had in years. The boxes piled up around him, old memories, remnants of a past that had shaped him, but no longer defined him. He had worked hard for this moment, this chance at redemption, and as he zipped the last of his bags, he knew that the city he was leaving behind wasn't the one he had come to know. It was a city filled with ghosts, ghosts of revenge, of anger, of regret. But the future was different. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack was ready to walk it, one step at a time. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he knew he was no longer walking with vengeance in his heart. He was walking toward something else, toward peace, toward a future where the past no longer had a hold on him. As he closed the door behind him, leaving his old life behind, Jack didn't look back. The road to redemption was long, and he didn't know where it would take him. But for the first time, he was no longer running from the past. He was walking toward the unseen future with hope in his heart. Jack's life had been a storm for as long as he could remember, a never-ending cycle of chaos, vengeance, and regret. But now, in the small town, nestled in Northern California, everything was different. The hustle and grind of Los Angeles felt like a lifetime ago. Here, in the quiet streets lined with trees and small, unassuming houses, Jack felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't that the town was perfect. It wasn't that the weight of his past had vanished, but it was a place where he could finally breathe, where he could begin again. The town was peaceful, almost to the point of stillness, the kind of quiet that made the days feel longer and the nights feel softer. It was a stark contrast to the relentless pace of the city he had left behind. There was no noise, no urgency, just the sound of birds, the wind, and the occasional hum of a car driving by. Jack had come here, not just to escape, but to reflect and grow. The tranquility of the place allowed him to finally hear his own thoughts, to take a hard look at everything he had been running from. He wasn't sure what he was looking for when he arrived, but the town felt like the right place to start over. Jack found a small house on the edge of town, a modest two-story with a porch that overlooked a field. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He spent the first few weeks simply settling in, taking long walks to clear his head, and finding small joys in the quiet rhythm of his new life. It wasn't easy to let go of the life he had known, the life that had been defined by pain and revenge. But with each passing day, Jack felt a little more at peace. Jack got involved at the local community center, where he started teaching life skills and mentoring people who felt just as lost and wronged as he had. The faces in the center reminded him of himself, people who had been broken, people who had let their pain consume them, people who had made choices they regretted. And like him, many of them didn't know where to begin in their journey to heal. Jack didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. So he began helping them, not by offering grand solutions, but by showing up, by listening, by giving them the space to express their anger, their grief, and their regret, just like he had done when he first started his own healing process. But it wasn't just about them. It was about him, too. As Jack gave advice, as he shared his own story of pain and redemption, he found pieces of himself coming back to life, pieces of compassion, empathy, and hope. They were fragments, but they were enough to show him that it was possible to rebuild, even when the world had felt irreparably broken. And then a call came. Rachel, she was coming to visit. The thought of seeing her again, after all that had happened, made Jack's heart race. He had spent so many months thinking about her, about their fractured relationship, about the years he had lost in his pursuit of revenge. They hadn't spoken much since the trial, the rawness of their last conversation still lingering in the air between them. But here she was, coming to his new home, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could start to rebuild, not the past, but something new. When Rachel arrived, Jack greeted her at the door, feeling a mixture of nerves and relief. They stood there for a moment, neither knowing quite what to say. But Rachel broke the silence first, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something, an acknowledgement that there was still love between them, even if it had been buried under years of pain and misunderstanding. Inside the house, they sat down together, talking not about the trial, not about the years apart, but about the present. Rachel shared how she was healing, how she had been working through her own struggles, trying to find peace after everything that had happened. Jack listened, his heart heavy with both guilt and gratitude. He realized in that moment that forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that would take time for both of them. But the fact that Rachel was willing to take that step, that she had come to him, was a breakthrough in itself. Later that evening, Jack sat alone, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He wasn't ready to let go of the past entirely. Some things, some people, would always remain with him. But he had come to understand that the path to peace wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and then choosing to move forward. In the weeks that followed, Jack wrote letters, not to confront anyone, but to clear his own heart. He wrote a final letter to Ethan Pierce, acknowledging the shared history they had, the pain, the mistakes. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about making Ethan pay. It was about closure, about finally letting go of a past that had chained him to anger for so long. Jack found solace in the small victories of rebuilding his life. He wasn't the man he once was, but he was becoming someone new. The old Jack, driven by vengeance, consumed by regret, had faded into the past. And as he stood one evening on a quiet hilltop overlooking the town, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The wind whispered around him, the sun dipping below the horizon, and Jack stood there, looking out over the town that had become his refuge. He wasn't free from his past, none of us ever truly are, but he had finally found his way to the peaceful path. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, Jack wasn't afraid to face it. The road ahead was his to walk, and he was ready to take the first steps. Jack's life had been steadily shifting since he moved to the small town. The quiet routine of his days, teaching life skills to those who had fallen on hard times, mentoring young men who carried the same burdens he once did, had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. The shadows of his past no longer consumed him. He had carved out a life where the chaos was distant, replaced by the simplicity of helping others. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the life he once thought he'd lead, but it was his. It was real. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt at peace with his choices. Yet, beneath this calm, something remained unsettled. A decision lingered on the horizon, one that Jack hadn't yet faced. He had built a new life here, a life far removed from the vengeance-driven man he had once been, But now, with every step forward, the past seemed to inch closer to him. Jack was faced with a choice. Would he continue this quiet life of reflection, or would he step back into the world he had left behind? The thought stirred something in him, a hesitation, a recognition that the past he thought he'd buried was still there, just beneath the surface. It was Rachel who called, as if she had sensed the conflict in him. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but there was a strain in it, a tension that made Jack brace himself. "Dad, Her voice faltered, and for a moment, Jack wondered if it was going to be another call full of distance, of unsaid things. Ethan's facing legal consequences for his actions. They're reopening the case against him, the one you were involved in. He's going to trial again." Jack felt his pulse quicken. The name hit him like a stone sinking into water. Ethan. After everything, after the years of silence, the thought of him, of their past, stirred a cold rush of emotion. Rachel's next words barely registered at first, but they cut through the fog of his mind. "She asked if you'd stand by him. I know it's a lot, but I don't know what to say. I'm asking you too. Would you?" For a long moment, Jack couldn't find his voice. He hadn't heard from Ethan in years, and yet, here he was again, pulling Jack back into the shadow of the man he had tried to escape. He thought about everything that had happened, Ethan's betrayal, the years of bitterness that had driven him to ruin everything in his pursuit of justice. But now, with Rachel's plea in his ear, Jack realized that the question was bigger than Ethan. It was about him, about what he had become. "I don't know, Rachel," Jack finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life trying to make him pay. I don't know if I can ever let that go." But as soon as the words left his mouth, Jack felt a strange weight lifting off of him. The truth was, he had already been letting go. His life here, in this town, had been about healing, about facing the pain, not letting it consume him. Ethan had been a part of that pain, but Jack had already started to move beyond him. He was no longer the man who lived for revenge. The question now wasn't about Ethan, it was about Jack, and whether he was ready to truly forgive, not just the people who had wronged him, but himself. The town's peaceful rhythm was shattered the following week when Jack received an invitation. It was a formal event, a public occasion, a chance to address the community. The invitation was not just to attend, it was to speak, to publicly acknowledge the past that had once defined him. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. Did he want to go back there, to the life he had left behind? Would he stand up and confront his past, the things he'd done, the man he'd become? As he sat with the letter in his hands, Jack reflected on his journey. The quiet life he had built here, away from the city and the chaos, had given him a second chance. But now he wondered, what did he want his legacy to be? Was it to be known for his revenge, for the anger that had fueled his every decision? Or did he want to be remembered for something else? For healing, for change, for finally learning how to let go? The decision wasn't an easy one, but Jack knew that the future, whatever it held, was his to choose. He had spent too many years letting the past dictate his every move, but now, as he looked forward, he could feel a sense of possibility creeping in. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't rewrite it. But he could walk a new path. He could start anew, not in the shadow of revenge, but in the light of understanding, of forgiveness. Jack sat down at his desk and wrote a letter to himself, not for anyone else, but for his own peace of mind. He wrote of the past he was leaving behind, of the anger he was releasing, and of the man he was trying to become. He ended the letter with a quiet declaration. Goodbye, old wounds. Goodbye, vengeance. The evening stretched on, and Jack felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of peace. The question of what to do with Ethan still loomed, but for the first time, it felt distant. Jack had already made his choice, and whatever the future held, he was ready to face it, no longer defined by the mistakes he'd made, but by the man he was choosing to become. As he closed the door to his past, Jack felt a new chapter unfolding before him, one where he would no longer be driven by the ghosts of his past, but by the possibility of redemption. The future was still unseen, but for the first time, Jack felt ready to embrace it. The sun was beginning to set as Jack stood at the front of the small local event, his eyes scanning the crowd. The room was quiet, the tension thick in the air, but for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel the familiar pressure of the anger that had once consumed him. It was a different kind of weight he carried now, one he could finally bear. Tonight wasn't about him seeking justice. It wasn't about revenge or redemption. It was about closure, about sharing his story, not to relive the pain, but to help others understand that it was possible to move forward. He had been invited to speak about his journey, about the trial, about the man he had once been, and the one he was now trying to become. The crowd was small, local, filled with people who had no stake in his past, except for the impact of his actions on their community. But standing there, in front of them, Jack felt vulnerable. The man who had spent so many years behind walls of bitterness, behind the need to make others feel his pain, now had to stand before them and share his truth. Not the truth of the trial, but the deeper truth of how he had almost lost everything, how he had been consumed by anger, and how he had finally learned to let it go. Rachel was there, standing quietly near the back of the room. Her presence grounded him in a way that nothing else could. The months of awkward silences, of broken conversations, had led to this moment where she was finally supporting him, not out of obligation, but out of the tentative hope that they could heal together. Jack caught her eye briefly, her expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty. She had come a long way, too. This wasn't just his journey anymore. It was theirs. Taking a deep breath, Jack began to speak, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. I've spent so many years trying to make people pay. I thought that was how I would heal. I thought that vengeance, justice, would be the end of my pain. But the truth is, it didn't work. His words hung in the air for a moment, and Jack could feel the weight of every eye on him, waiting for him to continue. What I've learned, what I'm still learning, is that healing doesn't come from revenge. It comes from forgiveness. It comes from letting go of the anger, from not letting it define you anymore. Jack paused, the silence of the room settling around him. The vulnerability was raw, and he could feel his emotions rising, threatening to take over. But he held firm. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to finally release everything that had been holding him back. I've hurt people, people I love, and I've carried that guilt for a long time. I thought if I made them pay, it would fix everything, but it didn't. What I realized is that the only person who could fix me was me. The only thing I could control was my own choice to let go of the anger, to choose forgiveness, not just for them, but for myself. His words, raw and emotional, seemed to hang in the air, resonating in the stillness. Jack could see the faces in the crowd soften, some eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time, he felt seen, not as a man who had been consumed by rage, but as someone who had walked through the fire and had emerged on the other side, still standing. Jack's journey had come full circle. The man who had been driven by a need for retribution was no longer there. Instead, there was a man who understood the weight of forgiveness, the cost of holding on to the past, and the freedom that came with letting it go. When he finished speaking, there was a long pause before the applause came, gentle at first, but growing stronger with every second. The sound of it wasn't as loud as he had expected, but it was enough. It was the recognition that his journey had meant something, that his story had reached people in a way he had never imagined. In that moment, Jack realized something important. It wasn't about the trial, or the people he had wronged, or the justice he had sought. It was about healing, about offering something more than bitterness. It was about giving others hope that they too could find a way out of the darkness. Later that evening, Jack returned to his new home, the quiet town stretching out before him as he gazed over the horizon. The weight of the last few years, the guilt, the anger, the regret, they felt lighter now, like stones he had carried for so long that had finally been set down. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, it felt like a possibility, a future without the shadow of vengeance hanging over it. Rachel joined him later, and the two of them shared a quiet evening together. It wasn't easy, Nothing ever truly was. But there was progress. They didn't talk much about the past, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were finally free. Free from the burden of anger. Free from the weight of old wounds. The scars would always remain, but they no longer had to define them. As the night fell, Jack stood by the window, looking out at the quiet town. The world was still, the future uncertain. But Jack felt something stir within him, a new kind of peace. For the first time in years, he was ready to walk forward, not with the weight of revenge in his heart, but with hope for what lay ahead. And with that, Jack took the first step into the future, no longer burdened by his past, but ready to embrace a new beginning.